Welcome again here in the Red Theater. I hope you had time to grab a good bite. Up next, we have another exciting session about education and childhood development, titled Tools of Tomorrow. How can behavioral science help the next generation navigate a world of tech and AI? One of the biggest questions in this time of incredible technological innovation is how these advances affect the youngest members of our societies, children. It has become increasingly common for children to be introduced to screens from a very early age. But how can we ensure that the use of technology enhances their learning and development without compromising their well-being? This panel discussion will draw on evidence-based strategies to unpack the potential, but also pitfalls of this reality, and how behavioral science can guide the thoughtful integration of digital tools in children's lives. To chair this discussion, I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Jana Flemming, who is the Director of Early Childhood Development at the Salama bint Hamdan Al Nahyan Foundation. Dr. Flemming has extensive experience evaluating the quality of early education programs and services, training teachers on best practices in early education, and advising policymakers on strategies to improve educational and social services for young children and their families. And for the panel that will help us unpack this interesting topic, we have Professor Jana Suskind, who is co-director of the TMW Center for Early Learning and Public Health at the University of Chicago. Professor Suskind has dedicated her research and clinical life to optimizing foundational brain development and preventing early cognitive disparities and their lifelong impact. Her work is focused in particular on helping parents leverage their power as brain architects. And we have also Andreas Schleicher, who is the Director of Education and Skills at the OECD. He initiated and oversees the Program for Student Assessment, also known as PISA, and other international instruments that have created a global platform for policymakers, researchers, and educators across nations and cultures to innovate and transform educational policies and practices. We also have Laura Litvine, who is the director of Bint France. She leads a team working on a range of social purpose projects, addressing a variety of issues, including education and the effect of screens on children. And last but not least, we have Hamda Mohammad Suwaidi, Head of Research and Continuous Development at the Knowledge and Impact Sector at the Abu Dhabi Early Childhood Authority. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed panel.
Thanks so much to the panelists. I really appreciate your being here. I'm looking forward to our exploring together ways in which children interact with digital environments, including their use of technology, as well as ways in which technology is used to promote and support children's learning and development, which includes tools for caregivers and parents and educators, as well as tools for children. A note to the audience, we're going to explore this topic across the age spectrum, beginning with early childhood and going on through high school. To get us started, I want to talk to or pose a question to my dear colleague, Hamda, who's based here in Abu Dhabi. Hamda, when did technology become a priority for the Abu Dhabi Early Childhood Authority?
Thank you, Dr. Jana. So back in 2021, the ECA launched the WID movement. And the WID movement is an international movement that brings local and global experts, partners, and disruptors to discuss challenges and opportunity, or future challenges and opportunity in the space of early childhood development. So during our first iteration of WID in 2021, one of the priority themes was tech humanity for children. So during WID, we convened a group of international experts and local experts to understand what are the challenges and what are the opportunities. And one of the outcomes of that convening was that we lack scientific evidence of understanding how do children interact with social media or digital media. So And today, 4 years later, it's still a critical priority. And since then, ECA partnered with NYU Abu Dhabi, NYU New York, and the City University of New York for a 3-year project. The project focused on understanding the digital space and the digital use of children and how do they interact with digital media. Also, ECA is working on the Digital Compass report that will be announced soon.
So what key insights emerged from the Digital Wellbeing Symposium and the WED Digital Compass report? And how can they be used to inform best practices for integrating technology into young children's lives?
So during our 3 years project with different academic institutions, we had the first Digital Wellbeing Symposium earlier this month. And during the symposium, we discussed that, or we highlighted that the digital screen time and non-screen time are the same. So there's no point of eliminating technology from children's lives. Instead, we have to look closely on how to basically include technology in a way that will help children and will in their developmental milestones, and also foster positive interaction between parents and children. Another thing the symposium shed the light on was the importance of child agency. By empowering children to be part of the process and decision-making on how they should interact with technology, foster critical thinking and resilience, and also create responsible digital citizenship from early ages. In the symposium as well, we discussed the output of the survey. The digital use survey interviewed 10,000 parents in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi. And it revealed some very interesting insights. 70% of the parents we surveyed actually are satisfied with the number of hours their children are spending on screens. Most of the parents had a very positive outlook on technology, and like 55% of them view technology and digital media as a tool to help their children learn and thrive.
Interesting. And so I know the Early Childhood Authority is very action-oriented. Now that you have this crucial data on technology use, what do you intend to do with it? What are the Early Childhood Authority's plans for it now?
So at TCA, we firmly believe that evidence-based data and research should drive, has to be at the heart of policymaking and program creation. So the survey and the Digital Compass report were developed with that goal in mind. We already start engaging with stakeholders from the private and public sector as well. One example worth noting is the recent signing of the UAE Children Digital Wellbeing Pact, which was signed in the World Government Summit in Dubai earlier this year. The pact is the first of its kind in the region and is designed to protect children online by promoting a safe and appropriate online environment, and also safeguard children from cyberbullying. The pact was facilitated by the Digital Wellbeing Committee and the Early Childhood Authority, as well as other government bodies as strategic partners. So the pact, I don't want to forget the names of the pact members, sorry. So the pact members are from the technology space, the content platforms, social media channels, internet and telecommunication service providers. So it included Snapchat, who are leading the pact for the first year, Meta, Google, TikTok, X, Yango, Samsung, Etisalat, and Do. So as I mentioned previously, that we firmly believe that evidence-based data and research should drive policy and programs. And we're very proud that we're not creating only frameworks with our collaborations with academic institutions, but also we're creating coalitions. And to make difference in children's digital lives, collaborations is not an option, it is essential. And it's only through responsibility across the public, private, and civil society that we will accomplish that.
Thank you so much, Hamda, for these insights into how the use of digital tools is being examined at the systems level. Now let's take a look inside learning environments. To continue on this early childhood thread, my colleague Jana has done interesting work building on our knowledge about the importance of human connection beginning at birth by developing an application aimed at strengthening the parent-child relationship or the caregiver-child relationship. So Jana, can you tell me, how is AI currently being used in early childhood to support children as well as their caregivers, including parents and educators?
Well, thank you for having me. So interestingly, AI in early childhood really hasn't infiltrated the way it's infiltrated most of our economy and K-12 space. But as we know, it's going to change pretty quickly. So I think there's no better time to start thinking about how AI, what type of role that AI can play in the early childhood space, both leveraging the potential promise as well as mitigating the potential significant threats. Because if anything has told us that we need to be thinking proactively, you just need to look at social media and the adolescent brain to know we need to be thinking proactively. And I think that AI's role in a positive way in early childhood should really center on three major areas. One, how can AI support the adult-child relationship rather than replacing it? Secondly, what are the ways that AI can reduce the administrative burden of the early childhood space, both for parents and caregivers? Because if any of us who are parents out there know, those early childhood years are incredibly intensive. And lastly, how can AI and the role of predictive analytics really play a role in not just supporting parents and educators, but more importantly, working towards early identification of delays and better personalized supports for children in the early years. And I think most importantly, we need to reject any AI technologies that really strive to replace that human connection. And I think there's really important understanding from the brain science standpoint to understand why this is such a different beast than K-12. I mean, K-12 is incredibly important, but those early childhood years, those first 5 to 8 years when the foundational brain development is occurring, I mean, 85% of the physical brain is being built in those first 3 years of life. And any environmental input is changing how that brain development is occurring. And while much of early childhood, we focused on the cognitive side of things, language and literacy development, the truth is the ability, the socio-emotional development, the ability for human connection, those foundations are built in the early years. So if you think about social media as altering teens' ability to connect as humans, really when we talk about the impact of AI in those early years, it will fundamentally, it'll hijack how those social connections are being built. So we need to be very proactive. I'm proud to say, I wanted to share a little bit about, this is not about rejecting all of AI technology, but really thinking about how we can leverage it in a productive, human-centered way. And so in our lab at the center at the University of Chicago, one of a number of technologies we're building is actually a wearable device that measures that important human interaction between adult and child, and really giving parents and caregivers insights into the amount of interaction that children are getting. I share this only because I'm at a behavioral conference, and so if you want to talk about nudges, this is really about a technology that gives insights to the adults and helps support the or facilitate nurturing behavior. The technology itself has been built with privacy in mind. It is not listening so much as on the device, it's measuring through algorithms the back and forth interaction between adult and child and providing the adults real-time feedback as to how much children are getting. We're also working on algorithms for early language assessments, et cetera, but this is the primary usage of this technology. There are many different use cases that we're exploring, both in the home, supporting parents with personalized insights into the early learning environments their children are receiving, as well as in early care and education. We have a big project with the state of Connecticut with their Office of Early Childhood, embedding this technology and really partnering with early childhood educators to figure out how does this help them give insights and better direct their types of nurturing interaction to all the children in their classroom. But we imagine this technology being used by many partners across the country and around the world, and importantly, garnering the important data that will really allow data sets that can help better personalize supports for all programs and better improve scaling, because we know that there are many wonderful early education programs for parents and caregivers and educators, but the ability to scale is quite difficult. And I think that the lack of big data is at the heart of it. This is just a picture, because everybody loves pictures of cute kids, of us in Connecticut with teachers and little ones wearing the luette. The teachers have a dashboard where they see, what little Johnny or little Jane is getting and can approach it in real time. But as mentioned, I think that one of the really exciting aspects of AI in early childhood is the ability to gain big data, big representative data, to better allow predictive analytics and the development of biomarkers or endpoint surrogates that can truly allow us to improve the outcomes of all children so that all children can thrive. Because the one thing that early childhood doesn't have is a lot of good big data, unlike many of the other fields. And I think this will ultimately really allow governments and policymakers and anybody who cares about the human species to provide and determine when there are early inequities and to address them, to identify those programs that are most effective for whom and why, and to better scale them, and ultimately allow a larger data set that can improve the development of all little humans. And ultimately, this is about finding the ways to leverage the best of AI without, most importantly, replacing that critical human interaction between adults and children. Thank you.
Thank you. This is great, in that you provided this really wonderful real-world example of how AI technology can be embedded in classrooms to support children's learning in positive ways. And the Luette, the device is just really impressive. But now I'm really curious to hear your thoughts about the risk in using this type of application, and in particular, what's being done to ensure that parents and caregivers don't get overly dependent on the app and really end up, or to the extent that they actually aren't developing their own intrinsic ability to observe and interact with children appropriately.
Yeah, no, I love that question. It's something that I think a lot about. The natural drive of parents to love and support their kids, that's a universal. I'm a physician as well as a researcher, and I can tell you in the last 20 years, there is not one parent that I've met who doesn't want the best for their kids. The way we see this device and technology is really giving sort of data insights into that interaction. It's not, let me be clear, it's not making it any easier, because it's really showing the ways that their talk and interaction are building their children's brains. I am more concerned, honestly, with technologies that lift burdens, but really are sort of replacing that interaction, because that makes parenting easier. Look, as a parent, parenting is hard. It is the most joyful, but it is a hard job. And you can imagine how technologies that, will read the same book over and over again without getting annoyed with a child, or other areas, could really sort of substitute that important human-to-human interaction. But I think all of these questions are critically important that we get in front of, because that natural drive to parent is what kept our species alive for millennia. So.
I know many people in the early childhood field are really eagerly awaiting the findings of the study you're doing in Connecticut. But the study will have significance that's much more broad than that. It's going to enhance our knowledge about using predictive AI to inform decision-making practice and service delivery across a wider spectrum. And so we're looking forward to that and wish you all the best. Now let's turn to Andreas. You're going to move us out of the early childhood field into kind of more solidly the school environment. And in doing so, Andreas is going to share data about the use of digital devices among students across the globe. So Andreas, building on your work at OECD, what can you tell us about how digital devices are impacting children's learning overall, and in particular, the importance of moving from simply consuming technology to using it creatively?
Yeah, thank you so much. And the first thing I wanted to show you is that for young people, 15-year-olds, the digital world has become the real world. When you look at the time they spend in school for learning on devices, and you add to this the time they spend on using their devices for leisure, the smartphone, you can get, close to the number of instruction hours. In Ukraine, actually, students spend more time online than they spend in front of a teacher, not because of choice, but because of the war. No? But you can see, actually, the UAE is getting close to that, basically, where, digital experience dominate learning experience. The question, of course, and that's your question, is this a good thing or a troubling thing? And, the answer is nuanced to this. When actually technology is used for learning in an intentional, instructional way, I think Dana shared a great example here, using AI for predictive analytics, you can see it can be a good thing. In some countries, actually, those lines go up. In some, they go down. But overall, on average, across the 85 countries for which we have data, it's basically something that you can use. But the line that goes down in every country is this one. Basically, this is smartphone use for leisure in school is very strongly related to negative kind of outcomes now. And it's not just, learning outcomes. You can see also, life satisfaction, emotional control, stress resistance, all of those things are actually associated negatively with, use of technology for leisure. And that makes you understand why many countries these days, discuss smartphone bans and things like this in school. But, beyond, that issue of access and bans, the bigger question, and I think Hamda and Dana already alluded to this, the bigger question really is how do we move from a consumptive use of technology that makes you addictive and passive and, to a creative use of technology. Now, and I want to show you a couple of data points on this. First of all, a really troubling finding. We looked at creativity among 15-year-olds and 10-year-olds. And when we measured that, we found that in almost every jurisdiction, 15-year-olds reported lower levels of creativity than 10-year-olds. If I would tell you, your 15-year-olds do worse in mathematics than your 10-year-olds, you do something about it. We would not accept that. But on creativity, for a long time, we didn't look at that now. And some people say, oh, well, that's all about, psychology. If you get older, you get more self-critical, less creative. But, those factors actually, or those relationships vary hugely across systems. It tells us actually is the environments we put in place that shape those kinds of outcomes. Now. So, of course, the question is, what can we do about it? And the answer is actually really interesting. First, the beliefs that we give young people about creativity are incredibly important. Growth mindset. You can see on the horizontal axis, education systems that have been good at, or societies that have been good at equipping young people with a growth mindset, tend to do also better on creativity and academic performance. There's some exceptions, but overall that relationship is really powerful and strong. A growth mindset, Money is not a great predictor of education performance. No. The United States spends 10 times as much as Vietnam per student, and Vietnam gets better results. So money doesn't predict very much, but growth mindset is one of the most powerful drivers of those kinds of outcomes. No. Second point I want to make is really the kind of attitudes that young people develop towards creativity. You can see here in this chart where we predicted, the scores on the assessment of creativity with, imagination. If you are open-minded, if you are open to new ideas, novelty. To what extent do we make young people reproduce the knowledge of our times or question the knowledge of our times? It's hugely predictive, really, on those kinds of outcomes. The openness to art and experience, and I say that because, art is often treated as a kind of extracurricular activity. But actually, if you look at this from the 21st century lens, it should be at the center of our experience. It's then, of course, your sense of self-efficacy. You can see actually very, very powerful predictors. I'm showing this because these are things that we can change in learning environments. These are actually, honestly, things that are easier to develop than, skills in calculus. We just pay less attention to them. Third part is in the social emotional characteristics. You'll not be surprised, perspective taking is a huge predictor. By the way, the explanation why women do better on creativity than men on average, because they actually are doing better on that kind of dimension, being able to appreciate different ways of thinking, navigating ambiguity, things like this. Curiosity, persistence, really important. Creativity is not just about having great ideas, but about pursuing things systematically, stress resistance, assertiveness, cooperation, emotional control. So once again, you can see actually these are drivers that we can shape through public policy. Let me show you one more nuance on this. This is the share of 15-year-olds who want to work in STEM, and I know the UAE, many other countries aspire to get young people, into STEM careers. But then look at this. The world's top-performing education system on STEM, you can look at Korea, Japan, Finland, China. Kids are doing incredibly well on STEM subjects, but they don't want to become scientists. You take a country like the United States, mediocre scores on STEM. They're doing so-so, but everybody wants to become a scientist. So what's the answer to this? It's actually very simple. If you do not enjoy learning science, if you just accumulate knowledge, better scores do not translate into better outcomes. If your teacher gives you that passion, that idea, that enjoyment of science, actually better scores do translate into higher aspirations for your life. So once again, it's when you know those kinds of things, not very difficult. If you just achieve good scores without those outcomes, it's not going to be very, very successful. I want to just, compare countries at the end of this. And if you actually, and this is really the heart of your question, ask yourself, what are the kind of educational outcomes you would like to see in order to drive, young people's ability to become a creative user of AI and technology rather than a consumptive user. The first thing is pretty obvious. Education should help you find out why you are here on this planet. What is the sense of purpose? It should help you, find out where your talents are. But your passion doesn't make you happy generally. It's about making a difference to other people, to your communities, and ultimately also being able to translate what you know and can do into better kind of jobs and better lives. If you think those are the kind of educational outcomes you would like to see, how well do we do? And that's going to be my final slide. I start with Japan. Most people, when they look at international league tables, they say, Singapore, Japan, these countries are doing incredibly well because everybody does well in math, in science, in reading. And it's true. They get 10 out of 10 points in mathematics. But when you scratch the surface, you can see Japanese or Singaporean kids are not that happy. They do not show the level of agency. Can you mobilize your cognitive, social, emotional resources? They're not very emotionally resilient. Can you reinvent yourself when the world around you changes? Those are incredibly important outcomes in the world of today that get neglected in part because we do not look at them. And you will always, what you measure is where you put your attention. So let's look at the UAE. It's actually really interesting outcomes. I know that there's still a long way to go to get this country up to, international standards on academic performance. The math and science bars, the yellow bar, is still pretty short. No? But at the very same time, you can see, for example, on agency, kids in this country can do things. You give them something, they try something, they apply their knowledge, and that is an incredibly important resource in the world of AI. They are emotionally resilient. You change things from them because they grow up in a world that changes every day. This is the place where actually tomorrow is going to be different than today. And 15-year-olds have internalized this. You can see they're in generally happy children. They have actually good school leisure balance. They can organize their work. They have, maybe social relationship is something. But last but not least, they are open to different ideas, different perspectives, something, So, of course, the big question, and with this I want to conclude, is, can you reconcile this? When you look at, Japan, Singapore, UAE, you may ask yourself, maybe we have to make a trade-off, that we can do either, do well academically and then the kids are unhappy, or we make them happy and then they lose out academically. But you look at Denmark. They get everything right. And there's a handful of countries, actually, that have been able to reconcile the kind of cognitive, social, and emotional outcomes you want to see in tomorrow's AI world. You can see happy children, academically well-performing systems, agency, resilient. So I think that's really the question we should ask ourselves. How can we create that all-rounded kind of educational outcomes that will enable young people to become active users and not passive consumers of the technologies?
I was actually going to pose that to you. Can you go back to the slide with the love and needs, the circles ones? That really struck me. In particular, just that there's this misalignment between what we know students, what the world need, this intersection between what students love and what the world needs, and there's a misalignment. You've touched on it a little bit, but I'm just curious, what advice would you give governments or even just school systems or even parents about how to begin bridging that gap? Just maybe some concrete thoughts you might have about that. And is it more in the policy arena or is it somewhere else?
I think the difficult part is that much of that actually gets framed by, things like examination systems, university entrance, that actually is hugely influential on the attitudes, expectations of parents and their behavior. But there's also another dimension which is perhaps easier to shape, and that is the quality of relationships. When we actually ask ourselves, where do students really thrive? It's usually students who see their teacher as not just as a good instructor, but as a good coach, a good mentor, a great facilitator, a creative designer of an innovative learning organization. And that is one of the most powerful predictors, when you think back to what was your favorite subject in primary school, it's probably more to do with the teacher than with the content. And I think where you see that quality of relationships, and unfortunately in many education systems we've made education more and more a transactional experience rather than a social relational experience. And education systems that are good at that, where teachers know who their students are, who they want to become, and accompany them on their journey, you can actually see those students have a much clearer idea of the world around them. They have much better understanding of where their own talents are rather than just what the exam will expect from them. So I think actually investing in that quality of relationship is perhaps your second best bet after changing exams.
No, I love that answer. I'm always focused on the quality of relationships in general, and so thank you so much for that. Just in the interest of time, we have this sort of broad exposure to technology and its use across the age spectrum and in different environments. Now I want to turn to Laura, our behavioral science specialist here, to situate this within the conversation more clearly and within that context and that discipline. So Laura, how can behavioral science tools be integrated into the design of digital products to make sure tech can benefit and not harm children? We hear a lot about the harmful effects of screen time on children, and so I'm asking you to, can you really first start talking about how behavioral science can be used to guide children towards healthier uses of technology, and then segue into the things that need to be done to diminish the harm?
Sure, thank you so much. And I think perhaps if I can start with kind of like a slightly broader point about how can behavioral science help with just everything we've been talking about. And you can see there's a real role we have as behavioral scientists or people who work on understanding behavior in ensuring we can kind of communicate all this research and all these tools and all these insights to people who design education systems more broadly. So I'm thinking, then I'll go to the tech products. But I think everything we've been hearing so far has really been about how do we ensure that what we know about, social emotional skills, or how you build healthy relationships between parent and children, and then we make sure that we communicate this. And this is why I'm so happy to be here, because this is what this conference is about, making sure that, we kind of communicate all these learnings. Coming to your question, which I did not forget. So I think about it in perhaps, kind of what can behavioral science or behavioral levers kind of how can they help in this idea of designing products that can be supercharged, or can we use behavioral science to supercharge the good? That sounds a bit gimmicky, but basically improve the efficiency of all these good products, and then prevent the bad we can get to after. Supercharging the good is perhaps the things that we see most commonly is how can you use things about, how we know how to increase adoption, which is very often a problem. And very often, when you talk to people who design digital products, especially ed tech, they'll tell you, yes, I have a lot of, it's very easy to get the parents who are already kind of open to new ideas, open to new tools, looking for help to get those parents to use those tools. But how do you make sure that you get them in the hands of the people who probably need them the most? And in particular, there are also a lot of people, people who are in more vulnerable economic situations will also benefit a lot less from the technology. So adoption remains a huge issue, and I think we should not forget it, because very often, you don't want to be designing for the people who need it the least. And then you can use behavioral science as well, lessons for example, how you use reinforced learnings, how you design just your tools in the best way possible so that they are as efficient as they can. And there's a lot of insights around this. Kind of how can you help people plan? How can you send reminders? Things like, what Dana was talking about. A tool like this, to me, kind of echoes a lot to things that had been tested in the US before. I think it's called Ready for K, that we're testing now in the UK, which is called Tips by Text. So it's a good name. But the idea being, kind of how do you think about then, once you have those insights, how do you communicate them to parents? What form is your message going to have? How is it going to address them? All of those small things that are going to actually affect the efficiency of your tools, and that's been documented. And this is where kind of like, you can have these little helps from behavioral science to ensure that you maximize the impact of those types of interventions. And I think, in a world where we've been doing these types of things for a very long time, trying to kind of ensure that we use these insights, but AI is going to then change also the scale at which we can do it. And I think where an intervention like yours is so exciting is in the sense that like AI will allow us to be adaptive and make sure, for those who've been in this field, we've been talking about how, can machine learning help us design the best versions of intervention? Well, they'll adapt kind of iteratively to what people want, what people need, what people know, etc. And so this kind of adaptive capacity of the technology will then be completely, there's a real shift change with AI, because it can do this really quickly and really finely. And so I think that's going to be a really interesting thing. So this is all about supercharging the good and ensuring that you kind of use everything we know about increasing efficiency and increasing effectiveness. On the other side of the coin, and I think the kind of like preventing the bad, Andreas, you were talking about it, we know that there are aspects of technology that if we're not cautious, can lead to kind of like losses of creativity, losses of productivity, losses of well-being, real risks for mental health, of the use of social media. I mean, this is a different debate that we can get into, but in terms of kind of how we think about behavioral science helping prevent the bad is very much what you were talking about. Is like, how can we use what we know to try and give agency to children and families, and like really, kind of not try and nudge use, not do things like this, but try and think about, okay, how do I create tools to help people use this to the best, for in the best way possible for them and for their situation, and to build this resilience, build this autonomy. An example that I wanted to share, and I think is a nice example of this, is a project that we worked on at the demand of the French government, and we worked with Tralalaire, who are a French ed tech company, which I've told them before, it was difficult to pronounce for English speakers, but they do very, very good work and very interesting things on the part of the safe internet community. But anyways, and so the demand was at the beginning was, we would like to reduce screen time for kids. And that's how it came. And then very quickly we were trying to, say, it's not about I mean, I'm not going to bore you with the debates around, what's the right amount of screen time? Is there good screen time, bad screen time? Everyone kind of now, there's a consensus around the idea that there's no magic number. It's about the quality of the time that you spend on screens. There is a magic number that's close to 0, and then Dana, you will notice very much better than me for like very young kids. There is sort of a consensus that you should not put them in front of screens under 3. But anyways, and so this we're talking about 6 to 8 years old. And so the entire idea was like, rather than saying we're going to reduce screen time, we said, okay, let's try and give families the tools to build their own way of having conversations with your children around screens. How do you make sure that you can distinguish, kind of what's good, what's bad for your child, and you can be active in the way you plan this. And so we created this little app that was about inviting families to reflect on their own screen times, and we really pushed for something because we know that one of the strongest predictors of kids' screen use is parents' screen use. And so you make sure that you involve, the parents in reflecting on their own practices, come up with a plan together, try and commit to that plan, make sure, and this is where obviously behavioral science tools are all over this type of things, How do you kind of reflect on your practices? How do you try and internalize these learnings? And how do you make a plan? How do you commit to the plan? How do we send reminders, et cetera, et cetera? And so we tested this with about 150 families in France. It allowed us to gather a lot of learnings, and in particular what we saw that was very encouraging is that what they enjoyed the most was this idea about reflecting about their own practices and having very concrete tips about how do I engage my kid in that conversation about screen use. And it's a little bit like, we've seen in other places that parents really like when we give them concrete tips about how to talk to your kid about sex, how to talk to your kid about drugs. Well, same thing about screens. And in social media, we see it in teens as well. So this is really about this idea of like giving agency rather than saying, and it was a big shift change, right? Because right now the policy was, there was this like, 0369 that gave you very concrete guideline, no screen before 3, this amount of screen from 3 to 6, this amount of screens from 6 to 9. And that's really, disempowering for parents somewhere, because then you feel like you're failing, and then you're not being given these concrete ways of acting. And then my last point, promise, sorry, this is a bit of a rant. So beyond kind of giving agency, there's also another thing that we can do, and that has been hinted at a little bit, is about working with the tools themselves to ensure that we can design for prevention and good design that will have in its core the idea of preventing harm. And so a little bit like, kind of ensuring that privacy is at the core of what you design, ensuring that the way that you build your incentives, that you build your information, that it prevents harm. An example that's on a lot older kids, including adults actually, on work we did with kind of how can you prevent, the demand was how can you prevent the appearance of toxic behaviors in online multiplayer video games, where we know that, and there's a really interesting literature around how can someone that's actually has pretty good social emotional skills, pretty well balanced in daily life, suddenly can kind of go on these games and they call it the tilt, and basically go slightly bananas and adopt really toxic behaviors that are very harmful to themselves and to others. And so beyond kind of this usual code of conduct banners that you see beyond the screens, things that we know are easy to build consensus around, they can be non-controversial. It's okay, we'll accept the banner. But how can you work with the platforms, with the people who make those tools to ensure that, for example, you think through incentives so that incentives aren't kind of encouraging this form of like addictive loops, or you build the way you're matched with players so that, for example, you can be matched based on behavioral traits or on attitudes at that time or on incentives at that time, like what spirit you're in to ensure that you're not, that you're minimizing the risk of harm. So things like this, and this applies to social media as well. This applies to loads of things, kind of how do you, and now AI is going to make the platforms a lot smarter at kind of figuring out which state of mind we're in. And so, things when, for example, and we see things that are really dangerous now, you have some platforms that will adapt to how quickly they see you move your mouse to know whether you're tense, whether you're angry. Sometimes they'll do it to make you buy things more, but we could totally use these tools to say, well, when do we think that someone needs a break? And so you see these things appear in social media. You'll see like kind of, you can kind of regulate your own behavior on the platforms, but it's about basically using the best of behavioral science to kind of push this further and ensure that we can build something that works for everyone without removing agency. Sort of answering your question. Sorry.
No, you've answered my question very thoroughly. Thank you so much. I had 2 follow-up questions. I'm not sure if we have time for either or both of them. I'm not sure who's keeping time here, but I'll throw out both, and maybe you can decide which one you want to answer. One is, it has to do with the family app in France. I'm just curious to know, what improvements you're making to that, and is there any prospect for widespread distribution? That's one question you may choose the answer. The other really asks you to reflect on what the other panelists have talked about and whether you have any insights to offer how their work might be further enhanced by behavioral science. So if you have a quick response to either of those, that might help.
Sorry, because I can't hear you very well, but so there's an echo.
Yeah.
So you're saying how did we modify it after the test?
Yeah.
So I think what we try to do, and I think we haven't cracked the adoption problem, which is still a problem that, kind of, how can you get into the hand of the most vulnerable parents is still a real problem, and that's a problem for policymakers, and that's where, we really think that working in hand with the policymakers is key to make sure that then you can promote these types of tools and these types of things in the right places. Schools, kindergarten, family clinics, stuff like this.
Right.
But so I'm telling you what we didn't manage to do. What we did manage to do, so we worked in particular with things like reminders we realized didn't really work very well because they were being sent at the wrong time. So we make kind of these, really sort of, functional modifications to ensure that it works as well as it can. And then beyond that, we also worked in trying to make sure that it could be that it could respond as well as possible in terms of the alternatives that we were giving parents. So it needed to be made a bit richer in terms of kind of like, so if you're going to remove screens, what do you do? And so substituting behaviors and giving more ideas. And so this is the way, and and now the tool isn't maintained by us and it's managed by Tralala, and they've scaled it up and it's growing, it's being adopted more widely. But I think, again, this is like idea of like, and they're working, I'm speaking for them here, but they're working very closely with the Ministry of Education in France to ensure that these tools can be promoted and get to everyone.
Perfect. And so I'm getting a signal, I think, that we need to end. But did you have a comment, Jana? You were? No, okay, thank you. Unfortunately, our time has run out. I want to extend the thanks to all of you for the information and insights that you've shared. And I hope you, the audience, leave here with a better understanding of ways to promote healthy use of technology so that children and their caregivers, whether it's both parents or educators, are benefiting. I also hope that you have a greater appreciation for how behavioral science can be leveraged to guide meaningful integration of digital tools into children's development and learning and overall well-being. So thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you so much, all of you, for your incredible insights and discussion. This is such an important topic, and it's good to hear that policymakers and practitioners alike are innovating new tools and mechanisms for the next generation.